Hey Bayokes, I goofed up, did not pay attention that May 20th is our program night, but it's also Ryan's high school graduation. So unfortunately I had to back out last minute on teaching the class. I am so sorry. I just can't seem to keep my schedule straight, but I will. Martha has another program planned for y'all, and I will do this in person later, but I thought it might be kind of fun to go ahead and do a video in case any of you had your heart set on paper piecing and wanted to try it. This is the block that I had scheduled that I was going to show y'all. It's just a free block I found on the internet. I'll find that block and I'll link it in the comment. I'll link it with the video description when I post this and send y'all the link. I printed the pattern to use for the class. This is what I usually print my paper piecing patterns on. I go to Dollar Tree and get a kid's scribble pad. Now this is slightly oversized for my printer by like a 1/2 inch, so I just take a ruler and a rotary blade that I cut paper with, and I just trim it, feed it through my printer. It works great. But the advantage to this is it's usually like newsprint. It's that real thin paper, but you don't have like the ink on it from like using newspaper or phone books, which is another kind of paper you can use. This is the pattern. So this is all you're working with at one time. And then the 4 of these come together. Typically, I like to use a little ruler along the way. So I have this little small 6.5 inch ruler. It works great. Any ruler you have that's manageable, that's not like 2 feet long, that has a 1/4 inch marking on it, is great. I always trim with the rotary cutter. At the beginning, I'll use 1 pin to hold the first piece in place. And before I start sewing, let's talk a little bit about the pattern. So you'll see this pattern has numbers on it. Starts with the 1 in the middle, and then you got your 2 and your 3. Now, this isn't like most patterns. This is telling you the order of sewing. So this is the first piece that gets laid down, and this is the second piece. So between 1 and 2 is your first stitch line. Between 2 and 3 is your second stitch line. And I'll show you as we get to sewing. But that's how most patterns are done in order, are numbered in order of operation. Now, there are other patterns that are like if you're more experienced with paper piecing and you already can figure out the order. And believe it or not, after you do it for a while, you kind of learn the method behind the madness. So there are other paper patterns like this quilt I'm working on now. This one is by numbers. So like I knew from doing paper piece a lot, this is going to be the first one. And then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But you'll see those numbers aren't like that. That's because this is like a piece by number type pattern. Just to show you. So the advantages of paper piecing is you get these odd shapes without having to do the extra geometry. Like you can imagine the nightmare it would be to measure out and cut on a traditional piecing method. Say this triangle. Likewise, paper piecing opens up a new world and you're able to do stuff. This is a quilt that I'm working on now that's totally paper piece. So you can see you can get the round, you can get the points, and it can get very complex. Okay, so I'm gonna grab me some fabric and be right back. Okay, so for my square, you can see that first triangle is a background fabric. The piece number 2 is a piece of this, And then the piece number 3 is also my background fabric. So when I'm preparing to stitch the first couple of pieces, piece number 1 is what I want to work with. Now my fabric is actually going to go on the non-line side because I want to see my pattern so I know where to stitch. So I'm basically working in mirror image. So on my background, I have a white on white, so I have to be careful that I get the right side up. I want to put the right side of my fabric to where I can see the right side. Okay, so I don't want the right side facing the paper, I want it facing outward. But I want it on the back of the pattern. Now this is where good lighting helps. So, and this is a really oversized piece. If you're not confident, it's better to use oversized pieces and then trim the excess away. This can be done. The great thing about paper piecing too is you can use your scraps. You can grab any oversized scraps, little pieces of fat quarters, fat eighths, whatever you have laying around to use. I keep a lot of my larger size scraps in drawers just for paper piecing. So I'm gonna hold it up to the light and I'm gonna make sure that on that stitch line between 1 and 2 that I have at least a 1/4 inch overhang. When in doubt, make it bigger. And then I'm gonna hold it up to the light and make sure that all of this triangle, you see the shadow? All of that triangle is covered, all right? So when I know that I've got the piece number 1 covered, I'm gonna come back and just stick a pin right in the middle of my number 1 to hold that fabric there, because I just don't want it to slip. That's my starting point, and I want it to be right. So now, again, I've got an insanely large piece of fabric. Once you get better, you can go with smaller pieces of fabric. But for number 2, I want my piece of fabric to be big enough not only to cover this shape, but see how these points come to the edge and you got that extra 1/4 inch seam allowance? Any points that touch the outside line of the design, you want to make sure that your fabric is long enough to go over that seam allowance. Once you get more into it, you may see where, well, I don't necessarily need this one out there, but I do need these out there. That's fine. But as a rule, because I don't like to start over on paper piecing, I always make sure anything that touches that outside line also accounts for that seam allowance. So when I go to the back of my fabric, now this is the right side out. So it's kind of like piecing. I've got a line that I'm looking at on my side of the paper that goes across here. I'm putting the fabric right sides together. And the reason why I'm putting the fabric right sides together is because this is my sew line. So when I sew it right across there, this is going to be flipped and pressed. Okay? So I'm going to take a quick break and I'm going to go to the machine here in a minute and I'm going to sew from there to there. Now, machine settings, well, before I break, your stitch length on paper piecing, I like to put down to about 1.5. The reason for that is it puts closer together stitches. All that does is, one, makes it since you're doing smaller pieces, it puts your stitches shorter and makes it more secure. But the big thing is it perforates the paper more, so you can tear this paper away easier. Now that's a plus if we do our precision sewing. It can be a negative if we constantly have to rip out. I found this paper is just the right thickness. It's thick enough to be forgiving for like maybe 1 rip out. But if you make the same mistake over and over again, you're going to have 2 pieces of paper. Okay. I took and I sewed right on the line. I just started, I stopped. I did not back stitch. I used my thread cutter on my machine, but I didn't back stitch or reinforce or anything like that, because just like other quilting techniques, the other piecing process will lock those stitches. You'll notice my fabric kind of curled a little bit. I mean, my paper kind of curled a little bit because I did go ahead and I flipped that over. Now notice my fabric's wider than my seam. That's okay. No need to worry about trimming right now. We're going to go through a trimming process. But I went ahead, flipped it open, was careful not to skew it because that hangover, but just right along that seam, I opened it up and I gently pressed. Now, if your paper starts curling like crazy, you might want to turn the heat down on your iron, but it certainly ain't going to hold. It'll flatten out over time. Okay, so piece 1 and piece 2 is on there, and I know it looks nothing like the picture yet, right? So the next sew line, this is probably backwards, but this is 3, so this is going to be the next sew line. Let me show you how I trim up and prep the third piece. Okay, I had to get my tripod turned around. All right, so I got piece 2, piece 3. Put my stuff face down. I'm gonna have a lot of waste on this. Like I said, later on you get experience. So now, from here on out, this is the technique we use to the very end. Now you see, I've got the sew line right here that's next. I'm gonna grab at that corner, and I'm gonna kind of push down, make sure I'm folding straight along the line, and then once I'm sure, I go ahead and fold. This is where I take my ruler. My 1/4 inch line is right there. I'm gonna put that 1/4 inch line right there on the fold, okay? And then I'm gonna cut off my excess. All right. So now I have this piece. You can see the shadow of the fabric right there. I've got my 1/4 inch overhang because when I sew across that line, then I'm gonna have that straight 1/4 inch seam. Now, usually my fabric that I like to use, I usually have like a long straight edge, and I do that on purpose somewhat. So what I'm gonna do, I know that line's 1/4 inch under here. I'm gonna take, let me figure out my right side of my fabric. I'm gonna put the right sides together, edges lined up. I'm over my seam allowance because it was touching the outside. Okay, I just hold this, but if you're worried about slippage, you can always pin. Some people are just chronic pinners. I'm used to being able to hold it as I put it under the presser foot, and then I'm gonna sew right on that corner from that line to that line. I'm not gonna sew that seam allowance, even though I want that overhang. I only want to sew at the start and finish of the lines. And the reason being is because if I sewed way out here and then I went to try to fold on the next on one of these lines, it's going to be catching all the fabric and it's going to get wonky. So only sew the lengths of the sew lines. Okay, let me go to my machine and I'll be right back. Okay, so I sewed along this line and this line. I took and flipped it over. Again, I make sure that line is is folded up. I don't pull it crazy to distort it, but I do go ahead and make sure it's pulled, that the fabric is opened on that stitch line, and then I press. And one thing I did, because my piece was just big and awkward, just for my own handling, I just kind of lopped those corners off to go along. But see, I left a good bit, so when I get ready to trim along this line to square up the block, you know, I got something to trim. So that's piece 1, 2, and 3. See? So what's next is we go to number 4, which is right there. So we've already sewn 1, 2, 3. So number 4, we know we have a piece of fabric under here already on. Yes, it's not off like these were nice and lined up, but we know this is going to be the net stitch length, because this is where I have a piece of fabric under that's closest to that line. Okay, so my stitch line is going to be from there to there. My next piece of fabric, this is touching the outside, so I want it on to overlap that seam allowance area, and I am gonna fold my fabric. Boom. Okay, so now you see I have this is coming way out here. I've got this piece and this piece. So if I were to lay my ruler down across, it's going to cut not only this, but it's going to cut all that too. That is good. That is fine. All that's going to remove is extra bulk. It's not going to remove anything that you need. So you can use this method throughout. All that little piece you may throw away. Some of the bigger pieces, you know, if you got bigger pieces like this, put them aside, because you may use them for like some smaller triangles if they're big enough to cover. Okay. So now I have that. Now I noticed I got a little bit of a fold issue there, and I've already trimmed. Not a big deal, but just because I want it right for sewing, I'm gonna fix my fold. The only thing that's gonna do is add a little smidgen more on that seam allowance. It's not a big deal, but I do want the accuracy on my stuff. So, all right. So my next fabric for number 4, I want to make sure it's a big enough piece. This is extreme oversize overkill, but I want to make sure that it's enough to where when I put that fabric on that seam allowance, I want to make sure that when I fold it over with my 1/4 inch seam, that it's going to be more than enough to cover this piece and also go out to that, through that seam allowance. So like I said, I got a really big piece. You gain judgment with experience on this, and you put it there. Now I line up where my cuts are. I line the flat edge up. I open it, and I'm gonna stitch from there to there. Okay. Now, what if I wanted to not sew to the paper? Well, all I'd have to do, if I wanted to just reuse the paper, some people like to do this. This is not my preferred method, because I would just lose track. But some people don't like ripping paper, and it's worth it to them. So what they'll do is they'll do this fold and trim, but when they fold like this, and I would recommend, if you use this method, to stick a pin in it, but they would sew right up against this fold, but not on it. So, because you have your 1/4 inch seam allowance there, right? So technically I could go right next to this fold and sew, and it not be sewing to the paper. I could have started that from the first step, if I was good like that. But this is a basic class. But for you more advanced paper piecers, you might want to try it out. Just take and fold your fabric. Now, if I was going to use that method, I might make sure that my fold is not on the sew side. Make sure that if it airs on this side to account for the width of the thread and what it adds to the seam allowance. But I am going to be a chicken, and I am going to sew on the paper. I've got my right side. I double check, make sure my right sides are together, and I'm going to go sew. Okay. I've sewed from here to here by number 4. I flipped it over, hit the press. I ended up, so now I'm looking for number 5, which is across the way. Okay, and you'll see it kind of overlaps. So had I not started right on that line, I'd be getting into this piece. So that's why it's important just to start on your line, stop at the end of your line. You'll see I got the hangover past the seam allowance. That's good. All right, so now this is piece number 5. I don't have any fabric up here, so this is the logical next line that I must sew on, because I know I got fabric here and I know I got fabric here that's touching number, and fabric here. All 3 of these pieces are touching number 5, and all 3 of these pieces already have fabric. So I'm gonna grab at that corner, I'm gonna grab at that end of the line, I'm gonna fold, make sure my fold is correct, and make sure it's nice and flat. Now, see, that's some of my center triangle stuff. A lot of that's going to get cut. Put my 1/4 inch line along the paper. And be careful getting wonky angles with the seam ripper, and keep your fingers out of the way, because start getting sideways cuts. I don't recommend. I usually do away from me cuts, not across tops of rulers. That's how you cut fingers. Ask me how I know. All right, I have a smaller piece this time. So a right side together. I want to put my right side up. I want to make sure I have overhang. I'm gonna put the cut edge along the straight edge. Make sure that my fabric is going in across that seam allowance. Make sure it's extending past this. Nice straight line. Now I sew. Okay, so now I got this. We're getting a piece. All right, so we just did number 5. Now I'm not gonna bore you with each and every step, but number 6, I'm gonna do the same way. So I'll do number 6 next, fold, trim, sew, and then it comes to, oh, excuse me, you need the watch too. That's a good point, because 6 and 9's not over underline. So like you got 6 here and 9 there. So when this is not going to be the 6, this is. The way I know that is just look for 7. Usually if you're flipping back and forth from design, it's pretty mirrored. So we went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then we'll go 8, 9, 10, and 11. Now when we get on these little corners, remember you're not only touching the seam allowance on this line, you're touching it on that line, and you're extending out to here. So when you do these corner triangles in order, make sure you got enough to extend all the way out here, okay, beyond this line. I'm going to go ahead and finish this out, piecing this out, and then I'll come back and show you how to square up, because I think I've showed you again. So like this next step, we've already sewn 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Our next square is a 6. Yes, it goes off there, but that's okay. We're still gonna fold that. We're gonna still do our trim, and then we're gonna line up That's the background fabric based on the finished block. And sometimes if you get confused with these, sometimes these patterns will be like shaded in pastel colors or something. Sometimes they're just like this and you got to plan your colors. So sometimes when I first did this, I wrote background, 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 light, medium, dark, or, you know, L's, or like O for orange, or T for teal, or whatever. So you can write on that to keep your color straight. But this is a background based on the design. And then I will get a background fabric and continue as I've been showing y'all. I'll be back when I get the block ready to trim out. Okay, I know I said I'd come back when it was okay, I know I said I was going to have it all sewed when I come back. However, I found a teaching moment. Okay, so I'm down to the corners. I've stitched 1 through 9 and I have my hangover, and I just trimmed before number 10. And I was looking at my scraps, and like I had this piece of triangle and I was like, oh, that's big enough, right? You know, so I was thinking I might could use it. Or this one. Yeah, I was thinking I might could use this fairly decent sized triangle. Beware with triangle pieces. So when I turn over my piece, I like to test this with it kind of facing me. So that's the piece I want to cover, but I also want to catch all that seam allowance. So if I were to put this right sides together, this piece of triangle, and I keep my thumb, I kind of gauge about 1/4 inch that where the seam's going to be, and I fold it over, I might be cutting it close at this. Now I could move the triangle back and forth and make sure that I'm getting it. So like there, I see a little piece of paper sticking out, but I did trim way out there, so this piece would work. Now this piece, you know, if I turn that right side together, this piece, it might work too, but it's going to be close. So just something to keep in mind if you're using triangle or wonky pieces. Always do the little 1/4 inch folding test, because had this triangle been more like mirror image, like supposing the right side down would have been this and it would have folded, see, that would not work. So your triangle pieces, the triangle matters. So like if this orientation was right side together, that would be bad. This orientation, right sides together, that is potentially workable. Okay? Okay, I have all my pieces attached. So I did 10, and then 11 was my last piece. Now, I do not sew around the outside. That's where we connect the 4 blocks. So on the back side, I've got this mess, right? Doesn't look like much, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in. I like to take, when I'm lining up to cut, I like to make sure that my ruler is on that line, so I'm cutting against it, not cutting the seam allowance line off, because that is my literal 1/4 inch. And I will notice that my 1/4 inch line is right along that sew line there. I'll notice that I'll have my lines lined up on the side, so that way I'm getting a good square cut with the pattern. I'm going to cut the excess off. And of course, sometimes with my rotary blades, if I know I'm going to change them anyway, I don't care. But sometimes if I have like a newer rotary blade just for cutting fabric, I will change it out. I'll keep my duller roller blade sometimes and I'll write a P on it with a Sharpie and then use that one just for paper. In this case, I didn't really care because I am working on a paper piecing quilt anyway. So I'm doing lots of paper trimming with this blade. So before I do my next big real fabric project, I'll get me a good sharp blade. I am just rambling while I cut. Okay, so now I've trimmed it and I have my quilt block. Now this is the 1/4 of the finished block, right? So the way I would go ahead and do 4 paper piecings. At that point, I would remove my papers. I don't choose to use these lines. Now, if I could leave the paper on, and then I can line them up and I can sew on the line or what have you. But I prefer to take the papers off. This is just easier for me. Let me adjust my tripod here so I can get a hand free. Whoops. All right. I prefer to take the papers off. Now, usually what I'll do is I just start pulling. See how easy that comes off because of my small stitch length? And I'll just start pulling from one side and I'm gently peeling away. All right. So, notice I didn't sew up into that seam allowance. I just followed those sew lines. Sometimes you get little stubborn pieces as you get to the interior. So I just work outside in. If these start getting hard that have the stuff around, usually you can find a corner and scratch with your nail and pull up. Sometimes a stiletto or point of a seam ripper will help. But you kind of want to get the paper out of the seams as much as possible. If you had some tiny hangovers, because there are some intricate paper piecing things that will not let go. If you had like tiny bits of paper like that or something in there, it probably wouldn't like be a life or death situation. I admit I've left some in the sandwich of my quilt, but big pieces you don't want to leave in the sandwich of your quilt because eventually it wads and you'll see it through your lighter fabrics. I mean, eventually it kind of breaks down. So see how nice and flat your seams are? You look like a professional, right? So now I would have these blocks and then I would put edge to edge together because it's already squared up. And like a when I'm piecing a 4-patch while they're apart, I take this piece, flip it on this piece, flip it on this piece, and then I like to chain stitch and through my sewing machine. But yeah, you just join these and this to this, and then you fold over and do the same. In this case, because I joined it like a 4-patch, I also spun my seams to make it extra flat in the middle. But that was my paper piecing tutorial, and hope y'all have fun with it.